Hello again. We're going to continue on here with the second lecture for chapter 17, where we're going to talk a little bit more about blood composition. Hang on, let me make sure I didn't skip a slide. Okay, there we go. Okay, so in the last video clip, we learned that if you let blood settle in a tube, or if you spin it in a centrifuge so that that settling takes place at a much faster rate, the blood would separate into a liquid component on top, and that's called blood plasma. And then there would be a little strip in the middle called the buffy coat, which consists of white blood cells. And then beneath there you would have densely packed red blood cells, which would make up roughly about 45% of the volume. Blood plasma makes up, again, about 55% of blood volume. And it is the liquid extracellular matrix of the connective tissue that we call blood. Now, what is blood plasma composed of? 90% of it is water. Our bodies are water-based, so that's not a surprise. And then it contains many, many different types of dissolved solutes, over 100 different types, and those include nutrients like glucose, amino acids, lipids, things like that that your cells need for energy, and also as building blocks to make all their cell parts and carry out their cell functions, gases like O2 and CO2, hormones, wastes, various proteins, inorganic ions, things like sodium, that should be magnesium, not magnesium, calcium, bicarbonate, etc. All kinds of things dissolved in the blood plasma. And then you also have a fair amount of plasma proteins. So remember, proteins are larger organic molecules. And these stay in your blood. They're not, most of them are not taken up by your cells. They're mainly produced by your liver, which we'll hear more about later. And about 60% of your plasma proteins are albumin proteins. And albumin proteins play a really important role in osmosis and osmotic pressure. As we'll see a little bit later on, a key role there is making sure that plays a very key role in fluid balance between your interstitial fluids and your blood, and also assisting with the pushing of good things like nutrients and hormones and things like that out of the blood and into interstitial spaces, and taking up and removing the wastes that have to be carted away from your tissues. About 36% of the proteins are globulins. Some of those are the antibody weapons I was talking about on the last video clip that help you fight infections. And about 4% of your blood plasma proteins are called fibrinogen, and these are involved in clotting. So we'll be hearing quite a bit more about fibrinogen as we move through this chapter. All right, here's a little bit more about albumin, like I was talking about. About 60% of your plasma proteins are albumins, and they carry substances from one location to another. You know, there are some things that don't dissolve well in your plasma, and so albumins can bind those and transport those throughout the body. Albumin helps buffer. Remember, a buffer is something that helps control pH, so those albumin proteins play a role in that as well. And then albumin is a major contributor of plasma osmotic pressure, and the reason for that is because these albumin proteins stay in the blood. They don't move out into your interstitial spaces all that well. And remember, when you learned about osmosis back in Biology 201, you learned that water is attracted to solutes. So water is attracted to albumin, and since albumin stays inside your blood vessels, it's going to attract water from surrounding tissues. The water is going to want to follow that albumin. All All right, and if you're uncomfortable with that concept at this point, you probably want to review osmosis, and we will be covering that in more depth, especially when we get into Unit 3 and we talk about your blood vessels. So you got some time. All right, and as I mentioned on the last video clip, the formed elements are the cells and cell fragments of the blood, and only white blood cells are true cells, and by complete cells, that means that the cell has a nucleus where DNA is located, and then it also has the other organelles that you guys learned a little bit about at the beginning of Biology 201. Those are little specialized compartments in cells that have particular functions. Your red blood cells have no nucleus or other organelles. So what happens is they do earlier, your red blood cells come from the bone marrow along with all of your other blood cells, along with all these other formed elements. But your red blood cells actually lose their nucleus and these other organelles before they take on the role of red blood cell type work. So you'll be learning more about that shortly. Your platelets are actually cell fragments. They come from a much larger cell that breaks apart in your bone marrow and generates these platelets. And platelets, again, they're also called thrombocytes. And they play a very important role in blood clotting. Your blood cells really originate in the bone marrow, in your red bone marrow, if you remember red bone marrow versus yellow bone marrow from Biology 201. And for the most part, once they leave the bone marrow, they no longer divide. They no longer do mitosis and copy themselves. An exception, though, are lymphocytes. Lymphocytes are a type of white blood cell. You have several different types of white blood cells that we'll be learning about. And lymphocytes, which play major roles in helping you fight infections, they can still divide. Many of your lymphocytes can still divide after they exit the bone marrow. And they wind up getting stationed in parts of your body where they go on guard for bacteria and viruses and things like that that are invading your body from the outside. All right, so if you look at blood under the microscope, and we'll have more about this over on the anatomy side for chapter 17, but if you look at blood under the microscope and you zoomed in really closely with a high magnification, this is kind of typically what you would see. So you would see lots and lots and lots of erythrocytes or red blood cells, and they do look very much like this. They look like little pink donuts scattered around everywhere. And then you would see some larger cells kind of scattered around in there. Like this one, that's a type of white blood cell called a monocyte. This is an example of a lymphocyte like I was just talking about. Both of these are white blood cells called neutrophils. All of those are different leukocytes or WBCs. So if you notice how there are a whole lot more erythrocytes than there are those white blood cells there in our field of view in this microscopic image. And that makes sense because if you remember the tube of blood that we spun in the centrifuge, the red blood cells took up 45% of the space in that tube, and the buffy coat where these guys would be located was just a little thin strip between the plasma and the red blood cells. So it makes sense you're not going to see too many of those in a blood smear when you look at it under the microscope. And then if you look over here, these little things that look like little pimples, those are examples of platelets. And so a lot of times they'll just look like little ovals kind of scattered around on these blood smears. And again, they're not truly cells. They're pieces of large cells in the bone marrow that break apart before they exit the bone marrow and generate these little platelets. All right, so a little bit more about these different types of white blood cells. We'll be covering this over on the anatomy side as well. Your white blood cells can be divided up into two major categories. One category is called the granulocytes, and the other category is called the agranulocytes. A here means without that prefix. So Site, of course, means cell. Granulo is referring to granules. And what these granules are, they are little membrane-covered compartments that you find inside these cells, and they store substances that play important roles in their functions. These cells are all involved in your immune system. They help you fight infections in different ways or making responses to infections. These cells have different jobs that we'll talk more about later. But the cells that are called granulocytes, they have different chemicals and substances that are required for their functions. They're inside little membrane-covered compartments. And what they do when you make a blood smear, there are two dyes that they put on the slide. One has a pinkish color and one has a purple color. And different components in those cells take up more or less of those two dyes, and that gives you some different color patterns that you can use to identify and distinguish between these various types of cells. So the granules will actually look different colors. We'll talk more about that over on the anatomy side. So the cells that look spotty, the white blood cells that look spotty under the microscope, are your granulocytes, and there are three types. Neutrophils, which kind of have light pink granules, and they are by far the most abundant type of white blood cell you would see in the blood. Eosinophils, which tend to look reddish and have big red spots inside their cytoplasms. And the third type, these are pretty rare. Basophils, which have big bluish purple granules in their cytoplasms. So all three of those types are the granulocytes, and we'll be talking more about what they do in subsequent lectures. And here's the percentages among your total, all of your white blood cells together. Up there at the top, you can see in a normal healthy adult, what percentage of the white blood cells you would expect to be each of these different types. Lymphocytes make up about 20 to 40% of the white blood cells in a healthy adult, and they don't have little spots and granules when you look at those under the microscope like these guys over here do. So they're part of the A granulocyte group. And finally, you have monocytes. That's another type of A granulocyte, because you don't see, if you look, here's the cytoplasm all around it here. This is the nucleus, where you see these darker purple areas. The DNA in the nucleus takes up a purple dye, so they comes out dark and purple in color. The surrounding cytoplasm there in that monocyte has, you don't see any spots, so that's why it winds up being in the A granulocyte category. All right, so now that we have once again talked about some of these blood components, the next lecture we're going to start talking about your erythrocytes, your red blood cells, in more detail. And the erythrocytes and their functions will be the primary topic of chapter 17. The white blood cells, yes, we are going to talk about those in this chapter, but their functions are really more involved with immunity, protecting you from foreign invaders like bacteria and viruses. And we're going to cover the immune system in a lot more depth when we get to Unit 3.